In the early summer of the year 1973, in the quiet coastal community of Newport Beach in Southern California, an 11-year-old girl named Linda Ann O'Keefe began a day that seemed like any other. The sun had risen softly over the ocean, sending shimmering ribbons of light across the Pacific, and warming the streets of a town where residents felt safe, secure, and comfortably tucked away from the troubles of the outside world. Newport Beach, known for its beaches, boats, and calm suburban neighborhoods, was the kind of place where parents allowed their children to walk to school without fear, where community ties were strong, and where innocence seemed naturally protected simply by the peaceful rhythm of daily life. But on one tragic summer day, the fragile sense of security that held the community together would be shattered, and a mystery would begin, one that would linger for nearly half a century. Linda O'Keefe was described by those who loved her as bright, gentle, and curious, with a shy smile and a soft voice that carried a quiet kindness. She was attending a summer school session at Lincoln Intermediate School, a routine many children followed to prepare for the coming fall. For Linda, the walk to and from school was familiar. She followed the same path each day, weaving through quiet streets, passing friendly neighbors, and often enjoying the simple independence that came with being old enough to make the journey on her own. It was a normal part of life in a place where danger felt distant, almost unimaginable. But on that warm July morning, the world would prove that sometimes tragedy arrives without warning, even in places where it feels least expected. On Friday, July 6th of 1973, Linda attended her summer school classes as usual. Her classmates recalled seeing her in the classroom, sitting quietly, participating when asked, and preparing for the weekend just like any 11-year-old would. The school day passed without incident, but as classes concluded and children began their walk home, something changed. Linda phoned her mother from the school office, explaining that she did not have her bicycle with her and would need to walk home. Her mother expected her shortly afterward, but Linda never arrived. Instead, she disappeared along that familiar route, vanishing somewhere between her school and the home where her mother was waiting. As the afternoon faded into evening, worry began to set in. What had started as mild concern grew into fear, then into a desperate and consuming panic. Linda's mother retraced the route her daughter would have taken, driving along the streets where Linda often walked, calling out her daughter's name, searching for any sign, any clue, any glimpse of that little girl in her plaid dress. But the search led only to empty sidewalks and quiet corners. Neighbors joined the effort, stepping out into the warm July dusk with flashlights and determination, hoping the girl had simply wandered off, or maybe stopped to talk to someone. But deep down, unease was building. Something about this disappearance felt different. Something felt wrong. As night fell, police joined the search. Officers followed every possible path, reviewed Linda's known routines, and spoke with anyone who might have seen her that afternoon. Witnesses recalled seeing Linda walking, and some reported seeing her near a turquoise-colored van driven by a man who appeared to be speaking to her. The details were uncertain, the recollections varied, but investigators quickly realized that Linda had likely encountered someone during her walk. Someone who did not belong in that neighborhood and whose intentions were not innocent. The hours ticked by, and hope became harder to hold on to. Then came Saturday morning, July 7th. In a ditch about 3 miles from her school, 3 miles in the opposite direction from her home, the body of 11-year-old Linda O'Keefe was found. Her dress was wrinkled, her shoes soiled with earth, and her life taken with a cruelty that devastated her family and sent through the quiet community. Linda had been assaulted and strangled, her final moments stolen by someone who had managed to walk away without leaving behind any immediately identifiable trace of who he was. The discovery was heartbreaking, and for law enforcement, it was the beginning of a long, agonizing search for the truth. Linda's case quickly became one of the most haunting unsolved murders in Orange County. Investigators poured through evidence, interviewed witnesses, and constructed timelines. They examined tire tracks, clothing fibers, and everything found at the scene. They collected biological samples, even though forensic science at the time was extremely limited. In 1973, DNA analysis was not yet a tool that investigators had access to. The technology simply did not exist. Many cases from that era were built solely on witness statements, physical evidence, and intuition. But intuition alone could not identify the man who took Linda's life. The trail went cold again and again. Years passed. Witnesses moved away or forgot what they had seen. Memories blurred, evidence aged, and the identity of the killer remained hidden behind decades of unanswered questions. For Linda's family, time did not heal the wound. The grief remained sharp, made worse by the absence of justice. They lived with the knowledge that the man who had taken Linda from them had never been held accountable. And the Newport Beach Police Department never forgot the case either. As forensic science advanced throughout the 1980s and 90s, and again into the 2000s, investigators preserved Linda's evidence with meticulous care, determined that one day, when technology finally caught up, they would try again. That turning point arrived decades later. When DNA science began to evolve into something powerful enough to reopen cold cases, detectives revisited Linda's evidence. Her clothing, preserved all those years, was tested once again, this time with advanced methods capable of detecting and isolating even trace amounts of genetic material. When the male DNA was discovered, it became the first solid lead in nearly half a century. For the first time since that tragic day in 1973, investigators had something real, something concrete, something that could speak for Linda even after all the years she had been gone. Still, finding a DNA profile was only the beginning. For many cold cases, a DNA sample without a name attached can feel like a cruel tease, proof of the killer's existence, but no way to identify him. But shortly before the year 2019, a groundbreaking method of investigation began gaining national attention: genetic genealogy. This technique used DNA collected from crime scenes and compared it to public genetic databases, identifying potential relatives of a suspect and allowing genealogists to reconstruct family trees. It was the same method that had led to the identification and arrest of the man known as the Golden State Killer. And now, investigators hoped it would finally reveal the truth behind the murder of 11-year-old Linda O'Keefe. In 2019, the Newport Beach Police Department submitted the DNA profile from Linda's clothing for genetic genealogy analysis. Specialists studied ancestral matches and slowly constructed a web of relatives, narrowing down their pool of possible suspects with painstaking care. Genetic markers were compared, possibilities were eliminated, and eventually, one name remained: a man in his early 70s named James Allen Neal. In 1973, he had been a 26-year-old living in Southern California. He had a history of nonviolent crimes and periods of incarceration, but nothing in his record hinted at the brutality he was believed to have committed. Yet the science was clear. The DNA match left little room for doubt. James Neal was arrested in February of 2019 for the murder of Linda O'Keefe. News of the arrest spread quickly, and for the first time in 46 years, Linda's family and the Newport Beach community saw a glimmer of long-awaited justice. But the story would not end in a courtroom. In July of 2020, while awaiting trial, James Neal died in custody at the age of 73. He never stood before a jury. He never faced the consequences of what he had done. He never answered the questions that haunted investigators and Linda's loved ones for nearly half a century. Yet even though the man suspected of taking Linda's life would never face sentencing, science had spoken. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows of time. And in the world of cold case investigations, Linda's story became one of determination, perseverance, and the power of evolving forensic technology. It showed that even after decades, justice can take form, and voices silenced long ago can still be heard through the evidence they leave behind. As the years slipped further away from that devastating summer day in the early 1970s, the case of 11-year-old Linda Ann O'Keefe became one of those stories that hovered like a shadow across time. Never truly forgotten, but never resolved, lingering in a painful place between memory and mystery. For investigators, Linda's case represented a promise they refused to break. For her family, it was the weight of heartbreak that decades could not dull. And for the community, it became a haunting reminder that beneath the peaceful surface of even the safest places, danger can sometimes pass quietly, unnoticed, changing lives forever. In the first months and years after the crime, detectives pursued every lead they could find. They interviewed anyone who might have known anything, from classmates to teachers, from neighbors to local workers who might have seen something unusual on that warm July afternoon. They reviewed vehicle sightings, especially those related to the turquoise van witnesses reported. The description was vague, the details blurred by fear and the passage of time, but the possibility of that vehicle being connected to Linda's disappearance made it a key point of focus. Detectives traced every van owner they could locate, but license plate memories were incomplete, and nothing obtained pointed definitively to a suspect. Investigators dug into the routines of individuals living in nearby towns, looking for any person whose behavior seemed suspicious. But every lead fell apart under scrutiny. As the 1970s faded into the 1980s, the case file grew thicker, but the answers remained distant. What made the investigation particularly difficult was the lack of physical evidence capable of pointing to one specific individual. Before DNA science matured, cases like Linda's often found themselves trapped within decades-long stalemates. No fingerprints of value had been left behind, no recognizable tire track impressions could be linked to a specific vehicle, and no witness had come forward with information precise enough to identify a definite suspect. Cold cases from this era were often solved through confession or chance, and neither of those had arrived. But something else was happening as the years progressed. Technology was slowly catching up with the needs of justice. In the mid-1980s, the concept of DNA profiling entered the world of criminal investigation. At the time, it was groundbreaking but limited, used sparingly, and expensive to process. Many police departments across the country hesitated to rely on the new science, uncertain of its reliability or widespread acceptance. But as the late 1980s transitioned into the 90s, DNA analysis became increasingly refined, increasingly precise, and increasingly trusted. And detectives in Newport Beach began to revisit Linda's case with fresh eyes, as they realized that the evidence preserved in the 1970s might carry hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. The clothing Linda wore on the day she was kidnapped became the centerpiece of renewed efforts. Investigators had preserved it carefully, knowing that someday technology might allow them to extract information they could not yet access. Evidence handling practices evolved with time, and eventually, the items were stored under conditions that protected them from further degradation. This careful preservation would one day prove crucial. By the early 2000s, DNA testing had become an essential tool in solving violent crimes, particularly those involving sexual assault. Cold case units around the country were reopening dormant files, and previously unsolved murders began to find answers. Families who had waited 10, 20, even 30 years for justice were finally receiving closure. Linda's case joined the growing list of cases chosen for reinvestigation. When advanced DNA testing was applied to Linda's clothing, male DNA was found, genetic material that had been undetectable using older methods. The discovery was monumental, but finding the DNA was only the beginning. Investigators needed a name to attach to it. They compared the profile to national databases, hoping it matched an offender already in the system. But the search returned nothing. Whoever had killed Linda had managed to live for decades without leaving behind a traceable genetic footprint in any criminal database. It was frustrating, heartbreaking, and deeply perplexing. Still, hope was not lost. Around this same time, a new frontier in forensic science was emerging, and it would soon change everything. Genetic genealogy, a method that combined traditional family tree research with DNA comparison, entered the mainstream following the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018. For the first time, detectives could use crime scene DNA not just to match offenders, but to locate distant relatives, trace lineage patterns, and narrow down living suspects based on family trees constructed through historical records. It was a breakthrough that fundamentally expanded investigative possibilities. The Newport Beach Police Department knew that if any method could solve Linda's case, it would be genetic genealogy. And so, the once dormant DNA sample was submitted for analysis. Genealogists began piecing together a mosaic of ancestry, identifying distant cousins and extended family members from publicly accessible genetic databases. Using birth records, census archives, and family documents, they worked backwards, generation by generation, narrowing possibilities until only a few branches of the family tree remained viable. Then, through elimination and probability, a name emerged. A name that felt out of place, yet unavoidable. Someone who might otherwise never have been connected to the crime. James Allen Neal. At the time of the analysis, Neal was a man in his early 70s, living quietly far from where the crime had taken place nearly half a century earlier. He had lived many different lives in the decades since. He had been incarcerated several times for nonviolent offenses, but nothing in his documented history remotely suggested the level of violence associated with Linda's murder. He seemed, at least on paper, like an unlikely suspect. Yet the DNA said otherwise. The genetic match was too precise to dismiss, too exact to be coincidence. Before his arrest, detectives tracked Neal's movements, collecting items he discarded in public, objects that might contain his DNA. This method is legally supported as long as the discarded item is abandoned property. When forensic tests returned, the samples taken from Neal matched the DNA found on Linda's clothing from 1973. The evidence was clear. Investigators had finally found the man responsible. In February of 2019, detectives traveled to Colorado to arrest him. The moment marked an emotional pivot point in one of the longest unsolved murders in Orange County history. For surviving family members, the news brought a mixture of relief, shock, and renewed grief. The decades-long ache of not knowing was replaced by the complicated awareness that the person tied to Linda's death had lived most of his life untouched by the justice system for that crime, while Linda's life had ended before it truly began. For the Newport Beach Police Department, the arrest was validation of years of tenacity, careful evidence preservation, and trust in evolving science. It was a moment that illuminated the power of innovation and reminded the world that even 46 years later, truth still had the ability to rise. The story, however, did not conclude with the arrest. As the legal process began, and the community waited for the trial that would finally bring the details of the case into the courtroom, an unexpected chapter unfolded. In July of 2020, James Neal died in custody at the age of 73. No trial would take place. No cross-examination would occur. No jury would hear the evidence or deliberate on his guilt. The legal process ended abruptly, suspending the story in a bittersweet space where answers had been found, but justice, in the traditional sense, remained incomplete. Yet in the landscape of cold case resolution, sometimes the truth itself becomes the form of justice that matters most. The identification of Linda's killer provided her family with long-denied clarity. It allowed investigators to close a case that had haunted multiple generations of officers, and it reaffirmed a powerful message: that persistence, science, and the careful handling of evidence can bring long-buried truths to light. As the truth slowly emerged from genetic evidence and shifting technology, the story of Linda Ann O'Keefe transformed from a silent file buried beneath decades of dust into a powerful example of what perseverance and scientific evolution can accomplish. But the path from tragedy to identification was not only a forensic journey, it was also an emotional journey, one carried by Linda's family, her community, and generations of investigators who refused to let her become just another forgotten victim. To understand the depth of this case, one must return to that summer of 1973, when the shock of Linda's disappearance struck the community with a force that would leave lasting marks. The Newport Beach of that era was a serene town. Residents trusted their neighbors. Children rode their bicycles freely, and the notion of a child being abducted in broad daylight felt like something that happened in places far from their quiet streets. For many people who lived in the area during that time, Linda's kidnapping and murder represented a sudden and heartbreaking loss of innocence. Linda's family carried that heartbreak intimately. Her parents, devastated beyond words, had to navigate a world that no longer held the daughter they cherished. Her sisters, still children themselves, were forced to grow up under the weight of grief and unanswered questions. Over the years, birthdays passed, holidays came and went, and milestones Linda never reached served as painful reminders of what had been stolen from her, and what had been stolen from them as well. The passage of time does not dull the loss of a child. Instead, time reshapes grief, turning it into a constant companion that moves silently alongside every memory, every photograph, every thought of what life should have been. Linda's schoolmates, even decades later, still remembered her. Many recalled small details that seemed inconsequential at the time: her soft-spoken voice, her neat handwriting, the way she sat in class with a quiet attentiveness. It was those memories that made the case more than just an unsolved crime. They made it personal. Her classmates became adults, built lives, had families of their own, and some even relocated across the country. But the story of Linda's disappearance remained with them. For some, the fear they felt at the time, the sudden realization that danger could strike close to home, shaped the way they raised their own children in the decades that followed. For the investigators who worked the case, the experience was similarly emotional. Some of the earliest detectives who had joined the search for Linda in 1973 carried the weight of her case throughout their careers. As they approached retirement and new waves of officers filled the department, the story was passed along, an unspoken oath that each generation would continue searching, continue questioning, continue hoping for a break. Cold cases often move across decades, passed down like unfinished legacies, each new detective inheriting not just files and photographs, but also the emotional burden of knowing a child had been taken, and justice had not yet been served. Some investigators spent more than half their careers returning to Linda's file, re-examining old notes, re-evaluating statements, and waiting for advancements in science that could help them move forward. It was common for detectives to revisit old cases late at night when the workload of active investigations slowed. Many would sit at their desks, dim light illuminating the faded photographs, wondering what detail they might have missed. Linda's case became one of those cases that investigators felt personally connected to, as if solving it was not just professional duty, but a moral responsibility. As years passed, however, physical evidence from Linda's case began to deteriorate. Evidence collected in the early 70s was never intended to survive half a century. Yet, through luck, foresight, and dedicated preservation, her clothing and various items remained intact, stored properly enough to withstand the passage of time. Modern forensic scientists often speak about the importance of careful evidence storage, and cases like Linda's demonstrate why. Without that preservation, the DNA that eventually identified her killer would have been lost forever. The path to identifying James Allen Neal through genetic genealogy was a complicated one. Genealogists working with law enforcement did not simply plug the DNA into a computer and receive an instant answer. Instead, the process involved months of meticulous work. They started by uploading the DNA profile into databases containing DNA voluntarily submitted by members of the public. These databases are primarily used for ancestry research, helping people learn more about their heritage. But with proper consent and oversight, they also became an extraordinary tool for solving violent crimes. When genealogists searched for matches to the DNA left on Linda's clothing, they did not find a close relative. Instead, they discovered distant connections, third cousins, fourth cousins, and even more remote ties. Each match represented a clue, a branch of a family tree. Genealogists collected these matches and began constructing multiple family trees, cross-referencing each branch, looking for where the genetic links converged. It was like assembling a puzzle in which most of the pieces were missing, and the picture on the box was unknown. Using birth records, public documents, historical maps, and census data, they traced families back to the 1800s in some cases. Slowly, as branches of the trees were connected, patterns began to emerge. Certain surnames repeated. Certain geographical regions appeared frequently in ancestral lines. Eventually, after eliminating individuals based on age, location, and probability, the genealogists narrowed the possibilities to one family line, one that led directly to James Allen Neal. Neal's life history became crucial in understanding how he might have crossed paths with Linda. In 1973, he had been a young man in his mid-20s. He moved frequently, struggled with stability, and had several encounters with law enforcement, though none for violent crimes. It was the kind of background that sometimes slips beneath the radar. Someone who had committed minor offenses, but never anything that triggered long-term surveillance or suspicion. Detectives determined that he had been in Southern California during the time of Linda's murder, and the timeline fit. Once the genealogists reached his name, detectives began building a modern case around him. They researched his past residences, employment history, and movements across the years. They interviewed people who had known him and reviewed any previous police interactions. As the pieces fell into place, investigators felt increasingly confident that they had found the man responsible. Still, they needed definitive proof. That proof came from the discarded items collected from Neal years later. When investigators compared his DNA to the profile taken from Linda's clothing, the match was conclusive. The odds of the DNA belonging to anyone else were astronomically low, effectively eliminating any possibility of coincidence. This revelation, after nearly 5 decades of searching, was the breakthrough investigators had hoped for, but feared they might never find. When Neil was arrested, the news spread quickly across the country. Cold case units, forensic scientists, and true crime communities recognized the significance of the moment. It was another victory for genetic genealogy, another example of how even dormant cases could awaken with the right combination of science and persistence. For Linda's family, the moment was overwhelming, a mix of relief, sorrow, anger, and closure. It was a reminder that while time moves forward, justice does not always move with it. Justice waits, sometimes in silence, until science or circumstance allows it to rise. Though Neil's death in custody prevented a traditional courtroom resolution, the identification through DNA remains a powerful form of truth. While it denied the public a trial and denied investigators the opportunity to confront him with the evidence, it ensured that Linda's story would not end in ambiguity. Her case became one more example that the passage of time can delay justice, but it cannot erase it. As the final chapter of Linda Ann O'Keefe's story began to settle into the public consciousness, her case came to represent not just the tragedy of a life stolen far too soon, but the relentless determination of those who refused to give up on the pursuit of truth. Across nearly half a century, her name remained on the lips of investigators, community members, journalists, forensic scientists, genealogists, and families who had faced similar losses. Linda's story made its way into classrooms, training seminars, and conversations about the importance of preserving evidence, improving technology, and revisiting cases long believed impossible to solve. Her voice, silenced at 11 years old, had somehow continued to echo across the decades. The reopening of Linda's case in the modern era encouraged law enforcement agencies nationwide to take another look at their cold case archives. Departments began re-examining files once deemed unsolvable, pulling boxes from storage rooms, reassessing old physical evidence, and reconsidering witnesses who might have long forgotten details until memory was sparked again. Linda's case became part of a movement, a reminder that even the most complex and aged cases could still yield answers when approached with patience, innovation, and the relentless refusal to let time become an enemy of justice. As the story unfolded, forensic experts reflected on the role of technology in navigating the past. In many ways, Linda's case symbolized the evolution of modern forensic science. When she was taken, investigators had little more than tire impressions, instinct, and traditional detective work. At that time, criminal investigations relied primarily on eyewitness accounts and limited physical evidence that often lacked the precision needed for definitive conclusions. But slowly, the scientific landscape transformed. DNA profiling emerged, databases expanded, laboratories improved their capacity to extract and analyze even the smallest traces of biological material. And finally, genetic genealogy pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible. In cold case work, genetic genealogy became a bridge, a way to connect the distant past with the present through the silent but powerful language of DNA. Forensic genealogists often describe their work as storytelling through science, finding the narrative hidden in strands of genetic code, tracing ancestral lines across generations until a name emerges. With Linda's case, that process allowed her to reclaim the story stolen from her all those years ago. Her killer had lived nearly his entire life, never knowing his DNA was waiting for the moment when technology would expose him. Even though the suspect, James Allen Neal, died before facing trial, the identification had an impact that reached far beyond legal proceedings. It brought resolution to Linda's family. It answered questions that had haunted them since 1973. It allowed her community to reflect not just on the horror of what had happened, but on the persistence that eventually led to truth. It reminded everyone that justice can take many forms, and that sometimes justice is found not in a courtroom, but in the undeniable clarity of scientific fact. As investigators closed the case, there was also acknowledgement of the emotional complexity of its ending. For some, there was relief. For others, frustration that Neil would never stand before a judge or jury. But in interviews and public statements, many law enforcement officials emphasized a deeper meaning. That answers matter. Truth matters. Closure matters. And the fact that Linda's case was solved at all, nearly 5 decades after her death, was a testament to the enduring commitment of those who never stopped searching for her. In the years following the identification of her killer, Linda's story continued to inspire discussions about victim advocacy, the importance of forensic evidence preservation, and the need for the public to support advancements in genetic technology. Cold case researchers, criminology students, and forensic scientists often referenced her case when explaining why unsolved crimes deserve continued attention, no matter how much time has passed. Her case proved that evidence does not forget. Evidence endures. And when science evolves enough to interpret it, evidence finally speaks. At conferences and symposiums, experts often point to the O'Keefe case to illustrate how cooperation among law enforcement, genealogists, scientists, and the public can transform investigations. Many emphasize the ethics of genetic genealogy, the safeguards required to protect privacy, and the importance of using such methods responsibly. Yet even with these considerations, the consensus remains strong. When used appropriately, genetic genealogy can offer answers to families who have waited lifetimes for justice. For Linda's family, the final confirmation of the suspect's identity brought a sense of quiet resolution. Though their grief would never disappear, the ache of unknowns that had haunted them for so long began to settle. They no longer carried the crushing weight of wondering who had taken their daughter and why. Instead, they turned their attention to honoring Linda's life, remembering her not as a victim defined solely by the tragedy of her death, but as a child who had brought light into the world, even in her short 11 years. Her story remains a tender reminder that every cold case holds a human life at its center. Behind the forensic tools, the databases, the files filled with details and diagrams and dates, there is always a person whose absence changed the world around them, a child whose laugh once filled a home, a sister who never grew into adulthood, a daughter whose life left an imprint on everyone who loved her. Cases like Linda's teach us that the pursuit of justice is not only about solving crimes, it is also about honoring lives. Today, Linda's case serves as a story of both heartbreak and hope. It stands as a symbol of what can be achieved when investigators refuse to give up, when science continues to progress, and when communities remain committed to seeking truth for those who can no longer speak for themselves. It also stands as a reminder that truth, even when delayed, still holds power. It has the ability to lift the weight of uncertainty, to offer clarity, and to restore a sense of balance to the families forever changed by violence. For many who follow true crime investigations, the story of Linda Ann O'Keefe is more than just a case. It is a testament to patience, perseverance, and the unwavering belief that no victim should be forgotten. It is a reminder that behind every unsolved case is a family waiting for answers, and behind every piece of evidence is a story waiting to be told. Through the dedication of investigators and the advancements of science, Linda's story was finally completed, not with a trial, but with truth. As this case enters its place in the history of forensic breakthroughs, it joins the growing list of cold cases solved through the union of old evidence and modern technology. And here, at Evidence Rewired, we remain committed to exploring these stories, rewiring the past, and shedding light on the cases that shaped our understanding of justice. If you found value in this documentary narrative and want to continue diving deep into the world of true crime, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support ensures that these stories continue to be told, honoring victims, uncovering truths, and keeping the pursuit of justice alive.